The original Twilight Zone is probably the most famous anthology series ever made. Not only do many of its episodes still stand up today, but as a pop culture icon, it's still frequently referenced and parodied even 50 years later. However, less talked about is its revival in the mid-80s, created by CBS, partly thanks to the Spielberg movie, but also just by how many people at the network at the time were fans of the original. As such, the series was greenlit, but sadly, like the original, it never became a huge hit at the time it was made. Rod Serling was dead by this point, but we had Harlan Friggin Ellison as a creative consultant and writer, with additional writing from George R.R. Martin and later J. Michael Straczynski. Wes Craven even came on as a recurring director for the series, so add that to the list of his awesome legacy. They even had a friggin' fantastic new version of the theme song done by the Grateful Dead. I especially love the opening sting of the theme. It's like that music from Star Trek the Motion Picture. But anyway, like last year with Night Gallery, I'm here to talk about some of my favorite episodes. These are my top 15 episodes of the 1980s Twilight Zone. Number 15, Her Pilgrim Soul. The Twilight Zone, while being science fiction and fantasy, crosses over into other genres: drama, western, and of course, romance. The romance stuff tends to be pretty schmaltzy and not really my thing, but then there's this episode. Two scientists are working on a holographic projector and discover the device working on its own, projecting out a fetus that grows into a baby, a little girl, and finally a woman very quickly. They discover that this is the soul of a woman from the early 20th century named Nola, and the lead scientist, Kevin, starts interviewing her about her life while the other scientist goes out to verify the information they learn about her. Kevin has been having marital problems for a while now, and the two spend the whole episode confiding in each other about their lives, their loves, and the connection the two seem to share. Like I said, I'm not usually one for this kind of thing, but it's executed very well, the music is heartwarming, and the acting is top-notch. Number 14, The Misfortune Cookie. Okay, now this one is just weird because it's not really a Twilight Zone episode, at least not in spirit. This one really belongs as an episode of Tales from the Crypt, from the overacting to the eventual comeuppance of its main character. Elliot Gould plays a snooty food critic who, angry at a food critic on television who gives rave reviews, heads to a Chinese restaurant that she was praising in order to destroy it with a review. He orders a bunch of food, then doesn't even bother to eat any of it. He's just a complete asshole. However, the owner of the place, as a form of apology, thinking he didn't approve of the meal, gives him a fortune cookie that predicts that he'll get some wealth. And he does so. The guy, of course, catches on that the fortune cookie's predictions come true, and thus keeps coming back to take advantage of them without paying, and keeps threatening to give another bad review if they don't comply. Like I said, you can probably guess where this ends up going with him, especially given the Tales from the Crypt comparison, but it's just so enjoyable to see him playing up this complete and utter asshole of a character.
What I say means something in this town. I'll be back with friends.
Look, my reviews have destroyed whole cities.
Number 13, The Burning Man. This one doesn't really make a lot of sense, but it's dripping in atmosphere, which I love. It's based on a Ray Bradbury story and is about a woman and her son taking a drive out to a lake for a picnic in the 30s when they come across a disheveled old man in a white suit. They pick him up, but he keeps talking about the nature of evil and acting crazy until finally the woman kicks him out. One of the things he brings up is how evil might need to be reborn and rejuvenated. Like Night Gallery, the length of certain segments varies, so this one's pretty short, as is the child the two pick up later, who also begins talking about evil. Number 12, Many, Many Monkeys. This was made for the third season, but actually the script comes from the original Twilight Zone. I'll get into the third season stuff later, but it's the connection to the original that's interesting. It was rejected by CBS, the producer of the show believing that the network found it too grotesque, which I find kinda head-scratching unless the makeup was gonna be different. The plot is about an epidemic that begins sweeping through the country, from the perspective of a hospital. People are spontaneously going blind. While a scientific explanation for it is offered at one point, one of the patients suspects that people are becoming like monkeys, see no evil, hear no evil, etc. In essence, that people are becoming so uncaring, so selfish and apathetic to others that we are literally turning a blind eye to others. It seems a little ridiculous, but then you see how selfish and uncaring people act in the episode, and you start to wonder if maybe there's some truth to it, even if they do come up with a surgery to repair the problem. For most people, anyway. Number 11, The Last Defender of Camelot. As I've said before, I'm a fan of Arthurian lore, although I'm quite out of practice with most of it, so this one's right up my alley. In modern times, Lancelot is still alive, granted immortality by Merlin. The wizard is actually summoning him for help, since he's waking up after his many centuries-long slumber. Morgan Le Fay is also still around, and warns Lancelot not to trust Merlin, and we soon see she wasn't kidding. Merlin is rather upset about the state of the world and wants to try again to unite it, except this time with himself as king. Lancelot, now changed thanks to time moving on and the old ways being, well, a bit outdated, challenges Merlin. Morgan even steps in to help. It's not really fully explored, but it's an interesting concept. As much as Arthurian ideas of chivalry and honor are celebrated, there's just as much medieval thinking involved in them, and if you don't change with the times, your own idealism may just be another form of evil. Good stuff, even though the special effects are... yeah. But hey, bad special effects are a Twilight Zone staple. Number 10, The Road Less Traveled. The best episodes of the 80s Twilight Zone are the ones that seem like they'd fit in right with the original series, and this one is no different. A family man who had evaded the draft for the Vietnam War begins to experience odd flashbacks as if he was a part of it. He's been feeling guilt over how he dodged it, as if he was meant to go back. And soon around the house are wheelchair marks and visions of a man in said wheelchair, until finally it's discovered that it's another version of him, from a reality where he did go to the war and ended up losing his legs in the process. Needless to say, his entire life has been absolutely miserable, and at first the man thinks that he's here to try to take his life away from him, not an unfair concern in a Twilight Zone episode, but the guy just says he wanted to see all of this, and he's happy that everything worked out so well for him. However, with both sides feeling either guilt or regret over their choices, they share their memories with the other so they can both fully appreciate what the other went through. Number 9. Monsters. Here's one for all of you out there who were horror fans as kids. A little boy named Toby, who loves monster movies, discovers that his new next-door neighbor is a vampire. However, it turns out a lot of vampire lore is inaccurate. They do need to drink blood, but garlic and silver and sunlight are not actually harmful to them. The guy's just old and wants to live out the rest of his days in peace, and there are not many left. See, the real downside of being a vampire is that regular humans actually have a complete aversion to vampire kind. Their presence awakens some kind of genetic illness that gets people sick until they mutate into monsters themselves that will attack and destroy the vampire. And yep, our vampire neighbor knows that and has come here to die. Number 8, Crazy as a Soup Sandwich. According to the DVDs, this was the last episode of the show, although Wikipedia lists the order differently. The third season of the show was not really meant to exist. The show was effectively canceled at the end of the second season, but the third season was made by a different production team so that the show would have enough episodes to be sold into syndication. The season has a different narrator, Charles Aidman for the first 2 seasons, Robin Ward for the third, who sadly just isn't as good, which is a feeling for a lot of the stories in this season. Most of them feel very much by the numbers, with plot twists you can see coming a mile away, and just a general feeling of laziness. However, there are some gems like this one. Harlan Ellison actually did come back to write this one. It's a comedy, which is especially telling to its quality because Twilight Zone, both in the original and this series, was not good at comedy episodes. There was an occasional decent one, but for the most part, they were more eye-roll worthy than funny. In this case, the plot involves a gangster on the run from a demon he made a deal with, eventually going back to a mob boss for protection. It's a pretty unbelievable story, but the mob boss buys it, and so we have this bizarre and hilarious clash of styles, the melodramatic demon and the stereotypical mafia butting heads. It's hilarious and wonderful. Number 7, A Small Talent for War. Another short one, but a good one. A fleet of alien ships arrive and address the United Nations, informing them that their species created humanity millions of years ago, much like they created life on many other worlds. And they're here to tell them that humanity has not met with their expectations. They have a small talent for war, their technology is not as advanced as it should be, that kind of thing. As such, they plan to wipe out humanity and start over, but the American ambassador gets them to extend the deadline by 24 hours to give them a chance to prove their worth. The aliens agree, and over the next day, they quickly work to bring about world peace, hoping to show that humanity is not as barbaric and uncivilized as they believed. But unfortunately, maybe the aliens should have been a little more specific about their expectations. Number 6, Shelter Skelter. This episode feels a bit ahead of its time and yet also fitting with the period. If you wanted a textbook example of toxic masculinity, you look to this episode. A man who lives with his family has built a fallout shelter in their basement, and he is obsessed with surviving nuclear war, constantly talking about how life will be better after the bombs drop. He rants and raves about all the immoral, useless people who will die and be discarded. He teaches his son how to use guns while seeming to ignore he has a daughter at all, to the point where, when it looks like war has finally happened, he begs his wife to only send his son back if she isn't going to join him in the shelter. But yeah, a nuclear explosion occurs and he and his gun-selling friend are locked inside the shelter. Unfortunately, the radio tower that was supposed to be used to keep them informed of any broadcasts is accidentally left out during the explosion, destroying it and cutting them off. They survive in the shelter for months as they pile up garbage, power slowly depletes, and the friend realizes just what a crazy asshole this guy is, still talking about how much better life will be when they do finally leave the shelter, even though the radiation hasn't gone down despite how it should have by this point. In the end, the man is left all alone, buried in his shelter. But I won't spoil the ending. Needless to say, he's exactly where he belongs. Number 5, Memories. A therapist who uses hypnosis for past life regression comments to one of her patients how she thinks it would be better if people could remember all of their past lives. How much more calming and agreeable people would be with one another if they had all those experiences. However, she wakes up the next day to discover just that very thing happening. Except the world is a bit of a hellhole like this. See, the problem with having those past lives is that they remember everything. Every wrong that's been committed against them and by who, so grudges endure from one life to another. If they have a crappy current life, they're more inclined to commit suicide in the hopes that their next life ends up better off, and all the traumas and psychoses they experienced in the past carry over into the new ones. I admit I don't really believe in past lives and reincarnation, but it's a pretty intriguing premise, and this episode is fairly original in that regard. Not trying to tell a love story or something with the premise, but just of how a world like this might operate. Number 4, Dead Run. A trucker having some difficulty finding work as of late gets a job with his friend for some rather unusual cargo. People. Or rather, souls. Yes, it seems the afterlife is not exactly all that great, especially when it comes to hell. See, hell is a bit of a bureaucracy, but not in the extreme way you would expect from the Twilight Zone, just that they constantly need to expand it out as more and more people are being hauled there because the rules haven't updated in such a long time. John Delancey plays a manager of hell, and he does so beautifully, putting up a convincing argument about how this is just the way things work, and you could get in serious trouble if you don't play by the rules, which our trucker is less than enthusiastic about. Speaking of Star Trek and John Delancey, check out an early appearance by Brent Spiner at the end. Oh, and hey, look, the House of the Book, aka the Command Center from Power Rangers. You were in Star Trek too. Neat. Number 3, To See the Invisible Man. In a totalitarian future, you can be punished for any number of crimes, including not showing enough concern for your fellow man. In this case, our main character has been found guilty of this, but his punishment is to be labeled invisible. A mark is put on his head to alert everyone around him that he is invisible. You cannot interact with him, look at him, or acknowledge his presence in any way. At first, he scoffs at it, since he hates having to interact with people and thinks he can get away with anything. But of course, people need interaction. They need to be social. and it just gets worse over time. Hell, even when he tries to indulge in loathsome acts like going into a women's locker room, he quickly feels ashamed and disgusted with himself, and of course, the people there do see him and are just all the more uncomfortable by it. It's not a permanent sentence, and it's a good lesson in humility, but the end result of all that is that he truly is more compassionate and caring, even if it means more problems for himself. Number 2, Shatterday. This one's the first episode of the show, based on one of Harlan Ellison's own short stories. Bruce Willis plays a man who accidentally dials his own phone number, and he answers on the other end. Yes, somehow he's been split into two people. Naturally, both are a little confused about this, but soon a battle erupts over which of them should be the true version of them. The one at their home takes steps to improve his life, making up with his mother, refusing to engage in unethical business practices, and just generally being a better person, while the one we started with slips more and more into sickness, trying to come up with excuses why he never tried to improve beforehand. It's a great character piece and a reminder that sometimes the better man really does win through. Before we get to number 1, I should mention a few other episodes of note. Something in the Walls, a creepy third season episode about a woman who claims the patterns on her walls contain beings that want to take our place. Button Button, a rather famous episode about a device that, if you press the button, someone you don't know will die, but you'll get a bunch of cash. However, upon watching it, I felt the performances went so over the top that it detracts from a fantastic premise. The Mind of Simon Foster, an episode with a great premise, but doesn't really explore it to its fullest, about a future society where you can sell your memories at the cost of losing them completely. Like I said, it just doesn't go far enough with its ideas, especially concerning a person's lost identity as they lose their experiences. There are also a number of remakes of old Twilight Zone episodes, and none of them are all that good. Probably the best is a remake of Night of the Meek, but that's because it sticks closely to the original. Plus, William Atherton playing an asshole, which we always love. The remake of A Game of Pool has probably the most problems, from bad casting to bad music choices to going with the original proposed ending for the story, which was a terrible ending, turning a story about the unnecessary sacrifices of trying to be the best and to be careful what you wish for into just, yeah, you didn't want it bad enough. There's also a remake of The After Hours, which had potential to push the horror farther, but like others, it didn't go far enough, and I ended up thinking the original was creepier. And my number 1 favorite episode of the 1980s Twilight Zone is Dealer's Choice. A group of friends have gotten together, including Morgan Freeman, to play poker. However, they soon discover that one of them is in fact the devil, who has come for one of their souls. This episode is brilliant, from the simple premise of the devil playing cards with a bunch of friends to just how great the dialogue is.
Yes.
Oh, man. Give us a break, will you? It's one thing being a devil, it's another thing being a total jerk.
Like I said earlier, the best episodes of the show are the ones that would fit right in with the original Twilight Zone, and this one would have been one of the greatest. I especially love how casual they are about the whole thing, even though they know how big the stakes are.
What's going on?
Nick's the devil and Peter's playing him.
How much?
$19.
If you're only going to watch one episode, watch this one. It's funny, it's tense, it's the Twilight Zone. Although I recommend watching the entire series. Sure, some episodes are better than others, but it's definitely more hits than misses. It was indeed worth stepping back into this other dimension for this little footnote in television known as the Twilight Zone. But if you want to see some other stuff spotlighted, come back on October 1st and every day in October for Long Box of the Damned.